Hey everybody. Today I'm reading a selection from Jesus Christ, Theory as Critique, Essays on Captial by Paul Mattick. And I think I'm going to read the piece titled Theory as Critique. So here we go. The sections of this piece are Section 1, Political Economy as Text and Discourse. Section 2, Representation and Reality. Section 3, The Starting Point. Section 4, The Argument in Captial. Already during Marx's lifetime, marginalism and general equilibrium theory were on their way to victory over classical political economy, deeply engaged with the labor theory of value. The effect of this victory on the evaluation of what Schumpeter called, quote, Marx the economist, end quote, is evident from the representative sample of opinions in the preceding chapter. Critics reject Marx as the pupil of Ricardo, while the faithful accept Marx as their heir. Developer and perfecter of the classical theory. For Rudolf Hilferding, who wrote the classic Marxist reply to Böhm-Bawerk, Marx, quote, was able to take up the analysis at the point where the investigation of the classical economists had been arrested, end quote. Hilferding. Because of his socio-political viewpoint, historical materialism, Marx was able to clarify theoretical issues which the outlook of the classicals left them incapable of solving. Marx's interpretation of the labor theory of value in terms of the materialist conception of history put the capitalist economy in its historical place as a specific form conferred on economic activities by capitalist social institutions. This demonstration, quote, signifies the close of political economy as a bourgeois science and its foundation as a proletarian science, end quote. This view, which is the ancestor of Sweezy's attempt to integrate Marxism into academic economics, a goal finally achieved by a younger generation with the post-1970s creation of academic, quote, Marxist economics, end quote, compared Marxism with marginalism as alternative economic theories. Acceptance of the subjectivist theory of value signifying for Hilferding, quote, the repudiation of economics, end quote. Hilferding. Böhm-Bawerk's criticism of Marx. That piece might actually be on this channel, I'm not sure. But Böhm-Bawerk's Karl Marx and the Close of His System is on this channel, which is generally considered one of the stronger critiques of Marx. Not that it succeeds in what it tries to do, but that it raises questions that are important. It is more surprising to see this picture of Marx as a Ricardian among the Marxists than among their critics. Footnote. For a fundamental discussion of this question extended into a critique of neoclassical economic theory, see Henrik Grossman, Marx, Classical Economics, and the Problem of Dynamics. End footnote. Marx gave the name, quote, classical, end quote, to the English tradition which in the theory of Ricardo, quote, reached the limits beyond which it could not pass, end quote. To contrast it with its later, quote, vulgarization, end quote, its transformation from science into apologetics. For Marx, not he, but, quote, Ricardo, ... gave to classical political economy its final shape, ... end quote. Marx, Critique of Political Economy as a Science. Even the works of socialist writers like Thomas Hodgkin and Percy Ravenstone, whom Marx praised for seeing certain matters more clearly than Ricardo, nevertheless constitute writings which defend the interests of the proletariat, quote, writings which defend the interests of the proletariat from the Ricardian standpoint, basing themselves on his assumptions, end quote. Marx, Economic Manuscripts of 1861 to 63. A deeper understanding of capitalism would require not the further perfecting of a theory already essentially brought to that theory's limits, but thinking of a different sort. Classical political economy's Ricardian socialist critique, and the vulgar economics which followed on what Marx called, quote, the disintegration of the Ricardian school, end quote, all share the assumption that basic features of capitalist society are necessary features of every social system of production. From this, in Marx's eyes, stemmed the limit to the development of economics as a science. The rise of modern industry, however, brought with it, on the one hand, recurrent economic crises, raising awkward questions about the naturalness of capitalist institutions, and, on the other, the working class movement, which answered them with talk about the construction of a new social system, as he put it in his polemic against Proudhon's attempt to create that very combination of Ricardian economics, French socialism, and Hegelian philosophy that has been claimed for Marx, quote, just as the economists are the scientific representatives of the bourgeois class, so the socialists and the communists are the theoreticians of the proletarian class, end quote. Marx, The Poverty of Philosophy. It was the crisis-stimulated upheavals of 1830 and 1848 which, in Marx's eyes, quote, sounded the knell of scientific bourgeois economics. It was thenceforth no longer a question whether this or that theorem was true, but whether it was useful to capital or harmful, expedient or inexpedient, in accordance with police regulations or contrary to police regulations, end quote. Marx, Capital. Marx explained the poverty of economic thought in Germany, his native country, in terms of the relation between the evolving capitalist economy and the theories about it. Germany was in Marx's time an underdeveloped country. There, quote, the living soil from which political economy springs, end quote, a self-confident, expanding industrial system, quote, was absent, end quote. Capitalism was coming to Germany at a time when class struggle between labor and capital was making scientific economics impossible. Was making scientific economics impossible. The historical circumstance forbade, in that country, quote, any original development of, quote, bourgeois economics, end quote, but not, quote, bourgeois economics critique, end quote. Marx, Capital. This, the critique of political economy, not its development or refinement, was the task Marx assigned himself. Immanuel Kant had used the word critique in his trilogy of major works to denote an inquiry into the limits of application of a set of concepts. Footnote. See Kant, Critique of Pure Reason. For a penetrating comparison of Marx's procedure with the Kantian critique, see Gideon Freudenthal's essay, Marx's Critique of Economic Reason, published in 1997. See in particular discussion on page 186, where Freudenthal develops the significance of a particular Kantian usage in Marx's argument. End footnote. The question of limits arises when the application of a system of concepts in some area of inquiry leads to problems unsolvable in terms set by this system. Thus, according to Kant, unresolvable disputes in metaphysics arise from the attempt to apply the vocabulary of empirical knowledge to a domain lying outside all possible experience. Hegel's conception of dialectics, Aufhebung, translated variously, but always hopelessly as, quote, supersession, end quote, or, quote, sublation, end quote, was a development of this idea. The term Aufheben has a double meaning, as Hegel points out, quote, 1, to clear away or annul, ... 2, to keep or preserve, ... end quote. That is, the critique of a system of concepts, or theory, requires the construction of a new system which replaces it, but at the same time, quote, preserves, end quote, it, in that it explains both the phenomena which form the subject matter of the original theory and the limitations of that theory. With respect to the, quote, preservative, end quote, aspect of critique, J. Witt Hansen has made an example of physics, pointing out, in an interesting comparison of Kant and Marx, that, quote, modern epistemology in the field of physics has taught us that the limits of application of a physical theory can be determined in an exact way only on the basis of a more general theory, which includes the theory in question as a special case, end quote. Witt Hansen, Historical Materialism, The Method, the Theories, Exposition and Critique, Book 1, published 1960. On the other hand, the element of what Hegel called, quote, negativity, end quote, the aspect of destruction, lies in the circumstance that a demonstration that the paradoxes which arise on the basis of a theory are not solvable within that theory, points to the existence of difficulties in the theory's foundations. Removing these difficulties, therefore, requires the redefinition of essential concepts, or at any rate new sets of assumptions associated with them. Thus, the sense in which a critique, or Aufhebung, quote, preserves, end quote, the content of the original theory is problematical. To continue the comparison with physics, this issue arises, for instance, with respect to the concept of, quote, mass, end quote, constant under changes of velocity in classical mechanics, but variable, because the transformable with energy in relativistic mechanics. Footnote: for a detailed example of the process of conceptual change within theoretical development, see Nereslin's study of the, quote, field, end quote, concept in the book Faraday to Einstein, Constructing Meaning in Scientific Theories, published in 1984, end footnote. We will see the same kind of issue in the transformation which the classical concept of, quote, value, end quote, undergoes in the Marxian critique of Ricardian theory. As the comparison with the history of physics suggests, the concept of, quote, critique is thus related to the more recent one of, quote, scientific revolution. And indeed, we find Marx speaking of his work in a letter to a friend as a scientific attempt to, quote, revolutionize science, end quote. What did he mean by this? Commentators, as we have seen, tend to understand Marx's theory of capitalist society in relation to its bourgeois predecessors and contemporaries on the model of rival theories of the same basic sort. Extended to the present, this conception underlies the idea of, quote, Marxist economics, end quote, as a school of economic theory contending with others. From this point of view, the dominant one, I believe, Capital, Marx's Capital, presents a critique of political economy in the same sense as that in which general relativity may be taken as a critique of classical mechanics. This is all the more true when Marx is thought of, and again I think this is the dominant view, as having adopted from his theoretical forebears the labor theory of value. From this viewpoint, essentially that of Hilferding, which we began this chapter, Marx's version of this theory may be an improvement over Ricardo's, and it may be deployed in a scientifically superior manner, but its fundamental place in his system makes him an heir of classical economics, in the same way that Einstein can be seen as an heir of classical physics. Footnote: for a contemporary example of this view from an author particularly sympathetic to Marx, see Duncan Foley, The Long Period Method in Marx's Theory of Value, in Volker Kaspari's edited volume, The Evolution of Economic Theory, Essays in Honor of Bertram Sheffield. End footnote. In his contribution to the Critique of Political Economy of 1859, the first published fruits of the labors undertaken in the Grundrisse, Marx described the situation in classical economics at the time of his writing, quote, since the determination of exchange value by labor time has been formulated and expounded in the clearest manner by Ricardo, who gave to classical political economy its final shape, it is quite natural that the arguments raised by economists should be primarily directed against him. End quote. There follows a list of 4 points to which the disagreement of the post-Ricardian economists could be reduced. Quote, 1. Given labor time as the intrinsic measure of value, how are wages to be determined on this basis? 2. How does production on the basis of exchange value, solely determined by labor time, lead to the result that the exchange value of labor is less than the exchange of labor's product? 3. The exchange value of commodities is ... determined not by the labor time contained in commodities, but by the relation of demand and supply. In fact, this strange conclusion only raises the question how, on the basis of exchange value, a market price differing from this exchange value comes into being. Bracket, this is what was to become known as the value price transformation problem, end bracket. ... 4. How does the exchange value of natural forces, bracket, which are not products of labor, end bracket, arise? End quote. Marx. Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. A striking fact about this list of problems is that it adds up to the main problem to which classical political economy had addressed itself. A striking fact about this list of problems adds up to the main problem to which classical political economy had addressed itself. An explanation of the distribution of the social product among the three great classes of workers, capitalists, and landlords, to be made possible by an explanation of the market price system as a regulator of social production. Apart from the degree to which his diagnosis of a political basis for the loss of faith in Ricardian concepts is correct, what Marx describes in this passage is evidently a situation of the sort that Thomas Kuhn famously analyzed in his The Structure of Scientific Revolutions as a, quote, crisis, end quote, in a scientific theory, in which an accumulation of important problems in a field leads to a general loss of confidence in the set of categories and methods guiding research and discussion in that field. Yet, although Marx's revolution aimed to solve problems that had arisen in the practice of political economy as a, quote, normal science, end quote, to use Kuhn's vocabulary, his intention was not to create an improved political economy any more than the communist revolution he envisaged was supposed to solve problems, poverty, inequality, unemployment, trade crises, produced by the normal functioning of capitalist society by reforming capitalist society. Footnote. That this degree is not negligible is suggested by comments by turn-of-the-century economists such as J.B. Clark's defense of the marginalist theory of the distribution of income. Quote, if, bracket, the workers, end bracket, create a small amount of wealth and get the whole of it, they may not seek to revolutionize society. But if it were to appear that they produce an ample amount and get only part of it, many of them would become revolutionists and would have the right to do so, end quote. J.B. Clark, The Distribution of Wealth, A Theory of Wages, Interest, and Profits, published in 1902. Cited in Haussmann, Capital, Profits, and Prices, 1981. Back to the text, sorry, I had to get a sip of coffee. Classical economic theory had not, like 19th century electromagnetic field theory, thrown up unsolvable problems in the course of yielding powerful explanatory and predictive results. Classical economic theory had failed at the basic task. Classical economic theory had set classical economic theory's self. Marx was the inheritor of Ricardo's economics, only in that Marx's starting point was the inability of the classicals to solve the problems which their analytic work had posed. What Marx did with his inheritance was to demonstrate that this inability was due not to some accidental shortcomings of Ricardo or the purely intellectual difficulty of the problems, but to basic assumptions of the classical approach. Marx promised to solve the problems produced by classical theory by his own approach, the first by, quote, the theory of wage labor, end quote, the second by, quote, our analysis of capital, end quote, the third by, quote, the theory of competition, end quote, and the last by, quote, the theory of rent, end quote. Marx, Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. This approach would not constitute an improved economics, but was meant to break the spell of economic concepts and theories on the minds of modern people. This kind of radical alteration in theory, involving a fundamental reconceptualization of its objects, is not peculiar to social science. The abandonment of Aristotelian for Galilean physics and the related early modern replacement of Aristotelian biology by mechanism were simply profound. Both these examples involved rethinking the similarities and differences between living beings and the rest of nature. In the first case, the dropping of an anthropomorphic concept of movement and force. In the second, a basic remodeling of the conceptualization of animate being. It was the remodeling of human beings as machines, footnote, is the remodeling of human beings as machines in the context of Christianity that produced the mind-body problem, which did not arise in the Aristotelian system. End footnote. In Marx's case, the change involved the reconceptualization of, quote, the economy, end quote, as a historical social construct dependent for its existence on humans' perpetuation of certain modes of conceptually mediated action. The scientific revolution effected by Marx, therefore, involved not only a redefinition of economic categories, but the construction of another sort of categories, explicitly social and historical categories. Footnote: the ideological, i.e. systematically misrepresentational, character of the economic categories is the heart of, quote, the striking analogy between metaphysics, in a narrow sense according to Kant, and ideology in the Marxian sense, end quote, to which Hansen draws our attention, because it was precisely the great metaphysical questions which could not be answered by pure reason. Kant claimed to be the author, not of a new metaphysic, but of the outline of entirely new science, the science of reason and reason's limits, which would provide a solution to all metaphysical problems by redefining them. See Witt Hansen, 1960. End footnote. Moreover, these categories bear on the social constructions, including modes of behavior and forms of conscious reflection on that behavior, on which the continued existence of the economy as a mode of social life depends. Thus, more is at stake in Marx's work than in relation between two theories. Since in Marx's conception, theories are to be understood as representations of socially regulated experience, theoretical critique here echoes Hegel's remark that dialectical consciousness is not, quote, peculiarly confined to the philosopher, end quote, so that it, quote, would be truer to say that dialectic gives expression to a law which is felt in all other grades of consciousness and in general experience, end quote. Hegel. In this, Hegel's formulation of dialectic goes well beyond Kant's conception of critique. Marx represents a further and distinct development of the idea, since he regards his theoretical Aufhebung, the critique of political economy, as a response not to some necessity inherent in the inadequacy of the conceptual structure of classical economics, an inadequacy that had not on its own provoked a theoretical advance among the economists, but is called for and rendered possible by the experienced crisis tendency of capitalism and the workers' movement corresponding to it. Although capital is recognized to be a critique of political economy, this is generally not taken to have important implications for the structure of Marx's argument. It is only natural, then, that for discussions of that structure, what he called the, quote, method of presentation, end quote, of his theory, to proceed primarily in terms of various logics of theory construction. For example, by searching for analogies to the progression of concepts in Hegel's logic, or more generally, by noting such features as a movement from relatively abstract to relatively concrete descriptions. I will argue that the architectonic of Marx's work cannot be adequately understood without direct reference to its character as a critique not just of rival theories, but of what I will call economic discourse. New section. Writing to LaSalle in 1858, Marx described the manuscript he was completing as a, quote, critique of economic categories, or if you like, a critical expose of the system of the bourgeois economy. It is at once an expose and by the same token a critique of the system, end quote. He goes on to say that, quote, generally speaking, the critique and history of political economy and socialism would form the subject of another work, and finally, the short historical outline of the development of economic categories and relations, yet a third. It is clear that, quote, economy is meant differently in Marx's description of his current project and his projected third book, and of his planned second book. In the first, Marx speaks of a critique directed at a system of social relations, in the second of a critique of economic theory. And yet, the ambiguity of economy appears also in reference to Kategorien as objects of critique. It is in fact essential to Marx's conception of his theoretical project that economic categories be both what Durkheim would call, quote, social facts, and what some later French thinkers would call, quote, mentalités, end quote. Cultural, embodied in linguistic behavior along with other modes of action, these categories, as symbolic representations of certain modes of social action, function to organize and can therefore be seen in those modes of action. A couple of examples may clarify this central element of Marx's thinking. Quote, art, end quote. Once it came to be used in the later 18th century to classify a range of objects and performances valued as collectible objectifications of creative activity. Both defined a type of production and could also be projected backwards into history to classify objects. Greek tableware, Egyptian temple statues, medieval altarpieces, originally produced with very different social purposes and significations. Footnote, see my Art in Its Time, Theories and Practices of Modern Aesthetics, published in 2003. Perhaps end footnote. I don't know if I said footnote, but anyway, back to the body of the text. Perhaps an even better example, because of its confusion of social, historical, and scientific aspects, is the concept of, quote, race. Like the categories of economics. See me. Where am I? Perhaps an even better example, because of its confusion of social, historical, and scientific aspects, is the concept of race, like the categories of economics, a product of early modern society. Although the consensus of scientific thought has long been that there are no races in biological reality, the concept continues to function, however roughly and even paradoxically, so that, for instance, in the United States, a, quote, white, end quote, woman can bear a, quote, black, end quote, child, but a, quote, black, end quote, woman cannot have a, quote, white child. So pervasively that it is almost indispensable in daily life in modern countries. As we will see in some detail, concepts like, quote, value, quote, labor, and, quote, capital have this culturally constructed character, speaking of historically variable forms of speaking of historically variable, quote, forms of social life, end quote. In the first volume of Captial, Marx wrote that, quote, the categories of bourgeois economics consist precisely of forms of this kind. They are forms of thought which are socially valid and therefore objective, for the relations of production belonging to this historically determined mode of production, i.e. commodity production, end quote. Marx. Captial. The economist category of, quote, value, end quote, was produced in the attempt to understand commodity exchange, which had long since developed as a social practice. The economist category of, quote, value corresponds to the vernacular concept of value invoked when asked what some good is, quote, worth, end quote, or if payment for it will receive, quote, value for money, end quote. What makes it appropriate to describe features of that practice themselves as categories is, in Marx's conception, is that they amount to a historically specific mode, what Marx calls a, quote, social form, end quote, of organizing the nature-imposed task of production. They embody, so to speak, a view of the labor process. In the exchange of commodities, the kinds of labor that have produced them are necessarily treated as interchangeable. Exchange establishes their interchangeability. This involves a different way of classifying, dealing with, and thinking about labor than one in which the products of different kinds of labor are not treated as interchangeable. Further, interchangeability of products makes the labor that has produced them social. In capitalism, it is the exchange process that, by realizing the social character of commodity-producing labor, signifies this mode of sociality. Other kinds of labor can have a social character as well, of course. For instance, much of the work performed in the household, but this can be explicitly recognized as social by the use of such concepts as, quote, chores. Commodity-producing labor has a specific status in capitalist society, namely, it is, quote, productive, end quote, labor, productive of surplus value. Commodity-producing labor is a special kind of social labor, and this character also needs to be signaled in some way. It is the act of exchange against money that in this case classifies the labor performed as social labor. As Marx explains it in the Grundrisse, money as, quote, sign of exchange value, end quote, is a, quote, symbol, end quote, that, quote, represents, end quote, the social labor contained in a particular commodity. The vocabulary of value, the equation of a commodity to a sum of money in answer to the question, how much is it worth, provides a signifier for this particular type of social labor. There are thus two levels of representation to be distinguished under the heading of economic categories. First, commodity exchange transforms every product of labor into a, quote, First, commodity exchange, quote, transforms every product of labor into a social hieroglyphic, end quote. In the exchange process, each of the two commodities exchanged represent the labor that has gone into the making of the other product, and by doing so marks that labor as social. Because equation to a sum of money is the only form in which labor is so marked, quote, value, end quote, as an expression in everyday language, is used to refer to an apparent property of commodities. On the second level, that of economic theory, quote, value, so used, is a phenomenon to be explained. It is asked what determines the value of a commodity, or in what value of commodities consists. Quote, later on, men try to decipher the hieroglyphic to get behind the secret of their own social product. For the characteristic which objects of utility have of being values is as much men's social product as is their language, end quote. Marx, Captial. According to Marx, the classical economists were not able finally, quote, to decipher their decipher the hieroglyphic, end quote. Specifically because the classical economists were unable to recognize the representational, the cultural historical character of value. To recognize this character, as Marx did, is to transform the conditions of theorization. From his point of view, though not in his words, to understand value is to understand a social practice and the discourse that is part of that social practice. Quote, political economy, Marx wrote, quote, has indeed analyzed value and value's magnitude, however incompletely, and has uncovered the content concealed within these forms. But political economy has never once asked the question why this content has assumed that particular form. That is to say, why labor is expressed in value, end quote. Footnote. See also Marx's comment in the manuscript later published as Theories of Surplus Value. Quote, ... Ricardo does not examine the form, the peculiar characteristic of labor that creates exchange value or manifests itself in exchange values. The nature of this labor. Hence, Ricardo does not grasp the connection of this labor with money, or that it must assume the form of money, end quote. End footnote. To ask this is to ask a social historical question, not one answerable within economics. Under what condition do people come to represent social labor in the form of exchange value? It is to ask a question about the historical conditions of economic discourse, about the circumstances under which the categories of economics have a use. Footnote. This, a question about the systemic conditions of existence of a capitalist economy, should be distinguished from the strictly historical question about the process that brought those systemic conditions into existence. The topic of Marx's projected third book, in the letter to LaSalle quoted above. End footnote. Marx's, quote, critique is thus an expansion of the Kantian idea of a demonstration of the limits of applicability of some theory, or, more broadly, some discourse. A historical critique of economic theory is also a critique of the social practice in relation to which economic discourse exists. Capital is, in accord with the intentions expressed in Marx's letter to LaSalle, not a study of political economy as a set of texts, quote, the critique of the history of political economy, end quote, which was to come later. It is an investigation of economic discourse, the field of categories defining a mode of conceptualization and discussion of social experience. For this reason, Marx refers to specific text in Capital, for the most part in footnotes, as illustrations of his analysis, because social experience itself has a discursive aspect, because the categories fundamental to economic theory are relative theorizations of categories describing, as they have in part, structures of social practice. The critique of the categories deployed in political economy raises questions about the society reproduced by way of that social practice. This is why Capital is a critique of economic categories as determinants of social practice, by way of an investigation of the conditions of applicability of economic theory. New section, Representation and Reality. In the, quote, general introduction, end quote, that heads the Grundrisse manuscript, Marx concludes a discussion of the sequence in which topics should be taken up in a critical study of capitalist economics by declaring that, quote, the order obviously has to be, 1. The general abstract determinations which obtain in more or less all forms of society, ... 2. The categories which make up the inner structure of bourgeois society and on which the fundamental classes rest. Capital, wage, labor, landed property. Their interrelation, ... 3. Concentration of bourgeois society in the form of the state, ... 4. The international relation of production, ... 5. The world market and crises, end quote. Marx, Economic Manuscripts. In the Marx Engels collected works. Not the economic and philosophical manuscripts, obviously. The preface to the contribution to the critique of political economy, the first published work to emerge from these manuscripts, restates this plan as the series of topics. Quote, capital, landed property, wage labor, the state, foreign trade, world market, end quote. This evidently corresponds to the contents of 2 to 5 in the Grundrisse plan, which in this form Marx never changed. Footnote. For a discussion of Marx's evolving writing plan, see Maximilien Rubel, Plan et Méthode de l'économie. I think that's actually translated into English. But, end footnote. We're back to the text. Abandon is what had earlier seemed the, quote, obviously, end quote, proper beginning of with a treatment of the, quote, general abstract determinations which obtain in more or less all forms of society, end quote. The general introduction is omitted since Marx says, quote, it seems to me confusing to anticipate results which still have to be substantiated, end quote. End footnote. End quote, end quote. Spacing out here. That's from Marx's contribution to the critique of political economy. A glance at the Grundrisse introduction shows the nature of these, quote, results, end quote. They fall into two main groups. The first Marx describes under the heading of, quote, 1, production in general, 2, general relationship between production, distribution, exchange, and consumption, 3, the method of political economy, end quote. The second falls under the heading, quote, 4, the means, parenthesis, forces, and parenthesis, of production and production relations and relations of intercourse, etc., end quote. Marx. Sections 1 and 2 concern general categories of the discourse of political economy. In the first, Marx emphasizes the social and historical nature of the human relation to nature, called, quote, production, end quote, thereby criticizing the economist's attempts to, quote, present production, as encased in eternal natural laws independent of history, at which opportunity bourgeois relations are then quietly smuggled in as the inviolable laws of nature, on which society in the abstract is founded, end quote. In the second section, he focuses on the, quote, various categories which the economists line up next to, end quote, that of production. Arguing against both bourgeois economists and radical critics of capitalism, notably Proudhon, Marx insists on the analytical primacy of the category of, quote, production, end quote, for social analysis. Finally, his discussion of method emphasizes again that, quote, even the most abstract categories, are, themselves a product of historic relations, possess their full validity only for and within those relations, end quote. The first group of topics then develops a critique of fundamental categories of bourgeois political economy, presumably the, quote, results which still have to be substantiated, end quote. Therefore, concern the limits and inadequacies of bourgeois theory. Their substantiation would be the Marxian critique as a whole, and in fact Marx returns to, quote, relations of distribution and relations of production, end quote, at the end of the materials published posthumously as Volume 3 of Captial. On the other hand, Marx judged it appropriate to give, in the preface to the contribution, a preface of his conception of the dynamic relation between, quote, production relations and relations of intercourse, end quote, in the form of, quote, brief remarks regarding the course of my study of political economy, end quote. Marx. Our contribution to the critique of political economy. These, quote, remarks, end quote, removed from their context, as they are in countless anthologies, constitute one of the best-known passages in Marx's works. The most concise statement of what came to be called, quote, historical materialism, end quote, is worth remembering that they represent a highly abbreviated residue of the last part of Marx's projected introduction to his critique of economic categories when we ask, as is rarely done, what is the significance of their presence at the head of the contribution beyond their announced purpose of demonstrating that Marx's views, quote, are the outcome of conscientious research carried on over many years, end quote. Marx. The central point of Marx's remarks is made in his statement that, quote, it is not the consciousness of men that determines men's existence, but men's social existence that determines men's consciousness, end quote. Marx. It was his conviction on this point that led Marx in the early 1840s away from philosophy to the study of political economy. In particular, Marx became convinced that a study of, quote, relations of production, end quote, was required if the prospects for social revolution were to be comprehended. Quote, in studying such transformations, it is always necessary to distinguish between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, artistic, or philosophical. In short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Just as one does not judge an individual by what an individual thinks about himself, so one cannot judge such a period of transformation by that period of transformation's consciousness, but on the contrary, this consciousness must be explained from the contradictions of material life, from the conflict existing between the social forces of production and the relations of production, end quote. Marx. At the time when Marx wrote these words, Marx seems to have believed that he was living at least near such a period of social transformation. He wished his work to contribute to the coming social revolution by clarifying the issues at stake. We may remember here the intentions stated in Marx's 22nd of February 1858 letter to Lassalle that, quote, another book, end quote, in addition to the 6 called for by the plan of his critique, should address the critique and history of socialism along with that of political economy, contributing to the political debate that would be part of any revolutionary movement. But just as the discourse of political economy is criticized in advance of detailed examination of the history of economic theory, so socialist ideologies fall already under the same critique insofar as they submit to the rule of that discourse. Thus Marx wrote to Weidemeyer, in reference to the chapters on commodities and money in the contribution that, quote, in these 2 chapters, the Proudhonist socialism now fashionable in France, which wants to retain private production while organizing the exchange of private products, to have commodities but not money, is demolished to its very foundations. Communism must above all rid itself of this, quote, false brother, end quote, end quote. This was all the more important in Marx's eyes as he had come, since his move to England, to understand that such ideas, far from being peculiar to Proudhon, were widespread in the English workers' movement. Essential to Marx's project, then, was a distinction between people's understanding of their social activities and the actual processes underway, particularly in a, quote, period of transformation, end quote. Such a distinction implies, first, the need for a redescription of those activities in terms systematically different from those in use. Second, it suggests that, in place of the usual procedure of an analyzing society by means of the categories in current use, the normal understanding of social life is itself to be explained by reference to features of that life as redescribed. Footnote. For a discussion of the epistemological issues raised by this project, see my book, Social Knowledge. End footnote. In the case of Marx's critique, the normal terms are those furnished by economic discourse, taken for granted by political economy. The workings of this discourse must itself be explained by reference to the categories of a newly produced social description. New section, the starting point. Marx takes his distance from the economist's representation of the social world in the first sentence of his text, quote, the wealth of bourgeois society, end quote. The contribution begins, quote, at first sight presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity, end quote. Marx. Contribution. Footnote. Lest this observation of Marx's be taken as outmoded, it is to be noted that Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, the most celebrated recent work of economic theory, defines, quote, capital as, quote, all forms of wealth that individuals or groups can own and that can be transferred or traded through the market on a permanent basis, end quote. End footnote. Captial, the book, only reformulates this with more elegance, quoting the earlier version to emphasize the continuity of thought. Quote, the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as a, quote, immense accumulation of commodities, end quote. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form, end quote. Marx. A contribution. Translation obscures the fact that Marx uses the same verb in both texts, erscheint, which refers, through Hegel's particular treatment of it, to the oldest of philosophical and scientific distinctions, that between appearance and reality. Quote, appearance, end quote, here indicates the terrain of economic discourse. The object of study is that identified by the, quote, father of political economy, end quote, Adam Smith, the wealth of nations, quote, the necessaries and conveniences of life, end quote. Smith, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, 1776. To begin with the analysis of commodities is to begin with the science of political economy, Smith initiated, which Smith defined in opposition to mercantilism's equation of wealth with money. From the viewpoint of political economy, as John Stuart Mill explained in his Principles of 1848, money is, quote, rightly regarded as wealth, end quote, but so also is, quote, everything else which serves any human purpose, end quote. Thus wealth may be defined as, quote, all useful or agreeable things which possess exchangeable value, end quote, i.e. as commodities. In his restatement of Mill's definition, however, Marx specifies the wealth under discussion by reference to a specific type of, quote, nation, end quote, bourgeois society. This sentence, then, contains in nous the program of the Marxian critique as a whole. The appearance of wealth in the commodity form is to be explained, in the manner suggested by the preface to the contribution, by reference to the system of social relations constituting the capitalist mode of production. If the mention of social wealth calls Smith to mind, Marx's initial theme, use value and exchange value as complementary properties of the commodity, evoked the author Marx considered the greatest of all economists. The first chapter of Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy, quote, on value, opens with the distinction between value in use and value in exchange. This is echoed by the second sentence of the contribution's chapter 1, and is the main topic of the version of this chapter in Captial, Marx's Captial as well. In this, Marx is choosing the path of Ricardo into economic discourse as against, say, that of Mill. Thus he insists in the Grundrisse that, quote, in order to develop the concept of capital, we must begin not with labor, but with value, or more precisely, with the exchange value already developed in the movement of circulation. It's just as impossible to pass directly from labor to capital, end quote, as Mill does in the first 4 chapters of the Principles, discussing value only in Book 3 on exchange. Quote, as from the different races of men directly to the banker or from nature to the steam engine, end quote. Marx, Economic Manuscripts. The reason is that, quote, labor, end quote, which can be used as a trans-historical concept, does not then pick out an element specific to capitalist society any more than, quote, means of production, end quote, does. Only when specified as the producer of value can the category of labor serve in an explanation of the nature of capital, accumulated surplus value. Thus it is that the index to the Grundrisse manuscripts, which Marx prepared as a preliminary to producing a publishable text, begins with the heading, quote, 1, value, followed by, quote, 2, money, and, quote, 3, Capital in general, end quote. When Marx began to prepare that text, Marx still called his first chapter, quote, value. But Marx opened with a sentence recognizably the ancestor of the initial sentences of the Contribution and Capital. Quote, the first category in which bourgeois wealth makes its appearance is that of the commodity, end quote. Quote, commodity, end quote, strikingly, is not among the, quote, simplest determinations, end quote, the thinnest abstraction to be reached through analysis of the concrete phenomena of economic life, such as, quote, division of labor, money, value, ... exchange value, end quote, listed in the, quote, general introduction to the Grundrisse. The analogous passage in the preface to the first edition of Capital speaks of the, quote, power of abstraction, end quote, as revealing, quote, the commodity form of the product of labor, or the value form of the commodity, end quote, as, quote, the economic cell form, end quote, of bourgeois society. This idea led, as we know, to the writing of the chapter on the commodity, which replaced value as the starting point of Marx's study of capital, or rather, which provided the theme in relation to which Marx developed the theory of value. Footnote, see Marx's letter to Engels, 29th of November, 1858. For a detailed and illuminating discussion of this transformation of Marx's plan, see Fred Schrader, Restoration und Revolution, 1980. This might seem to be a minor point, yet in his notes on Adolf Wagner, written in 1879 to 80, Marx stressed that, quote, for me neither, quote, value nor, quote, exchange value are subjects, but the commodity, end quote. Marx, marginal notes on Adolf Wagner's Lehrbuch der politischen Ökonomie. End footnote. One significance of this change is suggested by a passage in the Grundrisse, written before it was made, discussing the exchange relation. In the, quote, chapter on capital, Marx calls the, quote, pure form of exchange the, quote, economic aspect of the relationship, end quote, contrasting it with the, quote, content, which, quote, lies wholly outside the specifically economic form, end quote, and is, quote, the different use value of the commodities to be exchanged, end quote. This is the same contrast made in Capital by distinguishing the value form of the commodity from its use value, quote, the material content of wealth, whatever its social form may be, end quote. Marx, Capital. To begin with, value as such would have been to begin inside the discourse of economics. To begin with the commodity is implicitly to set the society in which that discourse has that discourse's place against other forms of society in which that discourse does not. Transhistorical content must exist always in one form or another, but there is no reason why transhistorical content must eternally exist in this form. Footnote. For a related argument about Marx's choice of the commodity as his starting point, see Martha Campbell's Marx's Conception of Economic Relations, published in 1993. End footnote. There's a further aspect of this matter to be noted. What is particular to capitalism is not the phenomenon of exchange value, but the fact that the commodity is the dominant form of product, so that wealth appears as a, quote, immense collection of commodities, end quote. This is only the case, as Marx argues in Capital, when the ability to perform labor is itself a commodity. Quote, the capitalist epoch is therefore characterized by the fact that labor power, in the eyes of the worker himself, takes on the form of a commodity, which is the worker's property. The worker's labor consequently takes on the form of wage labor. On the other hand, it is only from this moment that the commodity form of the products of labor becomes universal, end quote. Marx. The condition of this is the separation of the producers from the means of production, including land, which makes it impossible for them to produce goods either for their own consumption or for exchange. The generalization of the commodity form, that is an index of the class relations between capital and wage labor, the relation that makes possible the exploitation of the working class by the owners of capital. Its key point is the appearance of labor power as a commodity. Footnote. Derek Sayre is therefore mistaken in holding that capital, quote, in no sense, end quote, remains, quote, the starting point as well as the finishing point, end quote, of Marx's investigation. According to Sayre, quote, the hidden exegetical structure of capital is that of a hierarchy of conditions of possibility. Thus the commodity is analyzed before money and money before capital, the first form in either pair being a condition of the second. The concept of value is developed before that of surplus value, and that of surplus value before those of its transmuted forms, profit, rent, interest, for the same reason, end quote. Marx's Method, Ideology, Science, and Critique in Capital, by Derek Sayre. The hierarchy Derek Sayre has in mind is one of logical conditions, a structure that gives capital a, quote, quasi-deductive, end quote, form for good reason reminiscent of the, quote, dialectically necessary, end quote, sequence of categories in Hegel's logic. Without returning to the topic of Marx and dialectic, it can be pointed out that Sayre's purported logical chain of categories in capital does not exist. While Marx indeed defines capital, at least initially, in terms of money and obviously surplus value in terms of value, the commodity cannot, quote, be analyzed before money, end quote. Since the analysis of money is part of that of the commodity, under capitalist conditions, money and commodities exist together as elements of market exchange. As Marx argues, even if we imagine the simplest exchange of good against good, each must function, if the other is to be a commodity, as the value equivalent of the other, and thus functionally as already money. The commodity is discussed before money, not because the commodity is discussed before money, not because the commodity is a condition of the latter's existence, but because, as a unity of use value and exchange value, it represents the double character of capitalism as a particular form of the general imperative of production, whose historically specific aspect is exhibited in money. Further, as this suggests, capital is the condition for the dominance of the commodity form. Marx's starting point, in the words of the draft, quote, 6th chapter, end quote, of Capital, quote, only on the basis of capitalist production does the commodity actually become the universal elementary form of wealth, end quote. Marx. The cell form, Marx's results of the immediate production process. That quote is from Marx's Results of the Immediate Process of Production. The initial discussion of the commodity is thus already, as the opening sentence of Capital suggests, a discussion of capital. Finally, the concept of surplus value, as we shall see, is developed, quote, before those of its transmuted forms, end quote. Not because surplus value is logically prior, but because surplus value is epistemically posterior. The concept of surplus value constitutes Marx's theoretical explanation of the phenomena of profit, rent, and interest, which, as well-established elements of economic practice and discourse, occupy a radically different epistemological status than their Marxian explanation. Here, too, it is the relation of reality, surplus value, to appearance, profit et al. The relation of social theoretical explanation to ideological form, that is represented by the structure of the argument. For the relation between the focus on the commodity and Marx's discovery of the twofold nature of commodity-producing labor, on the one hand, and Marx's abandonment of a Hegelian mode of conceptual development in the presentation of his ideas, on the other, see Schrader, Reaktion und Revolution, 1980. End footnote. New section. The argument in Capital. The first chapter of Capital presents the general form of Marx's argument as a whole, within the limits set by its position in the book. Beginning with the commodity as the historical form in which wealth appears in capitalist society, Marx proceeds to describe exchange value as it, quote, appears, end quote, in the exchange ratio between two commodities. Quote, value is then defined as the reality, which thus appears, although Marx is quick to emphasize that value can only appear in this form. Quote, we may twist and turn a single commodity as we wish. A single commodity quote, we may twist and turn a single commodity as we wish. It remains impossible to grasp that single commodity as a thing possessing value, end quote. This is because value is a, quote, purely social, end quote, property, a relation between people engaged in commodity exchange, and therefore, quote, can only appear in the social relation between commodity and commodity, end quote. Marx. This reference to a, quote, social relation, end quote, between things is at once ironic, hinting at the topsy-turvy character of a world in which people represent their mutual relations by relations between things, and literally true, for as exchange is a social act, exchange relations are social relations, it becomes ironic when the actual exchangers are left out of the depiction of the act. And the irony is doubled when, in Chapter 2, the exchangers appear as, quote, bearers, end quote, of commodity relations, as persons who, quote, exist for one another merely as representatives and hence owners of commodities, end quote. Marx. Irony is the appropriate rhetorical mode here, for it is the particular set of social practices that go under the name of exchange that the discursive representation of those practices as an exchange of commodities conceals. Footnote. For a stimulating discussion of irony in Marx's deconstruction of economic discourse, see Wolf, Money Bags Must Be So Lucky, on the literary structure of Capital, published in 1988. Despite its excesses and errors, this is an interesting little book. Its treatment of Marx's critique of economics is all the more remarkable, given its description of Capital as a, quote, work of theoretical economics, end quote, and its author's own insistence in an earlier book on a neo-Ricardian reconstruction of Marxian theory, a project quite incompatible with the picture of the theory given in the latter volume. End footnote. Capitalism, like any other mode of society, must, whatever else capitalism does, organize the labor process by which human life is maintained. It is clear that, in the absence of any other mechanism for doing this, it is, as the classical economists already realized, the practice of market exchange that regulates the production and distribution of goods. For this reason, quote, the private producer's brain reflects, the, social character of the private producer's labor only in the forms which appear in practical intercourse, in the exchange of products, end quote. Marx. This is what Marx calls the, quote, fetishism of commodities, the treatment of the historical peculiarities of capitalist society, in everyday life and economic theory alike, as though they were, quote, as much a self-evident and nature-imposed necessity as productive labor itself, end quote. Ending with the discussion of this, quote, fetishism, end quote, Marx's chapter has begun with a set of appearances, the phenomena of commodity exchange, which are then redescribed in terms of a novel theoretical vocabulary, notably the distinction between abstract and concrete labor, that makes possible a social historical explanation of the appearances and their place in economic discourse. Marx is at pains in his chapter on the commodity to demonstrate the oddness, even the quote absurdity, end quote, of economic discourse. But the demonstration of its inability to account for fundamental aspects of capitalism comes only in part 2 of the first volume of Capital, which explicitly introduces the concept of capital. Capital is money advanced to make money, considered, quote, in the form in which it appears, erscheint, directly in the sphere of circulation, end quote. Its existence is inexplicable, for acts of exchange, as Marx argues, cannot produce an increment of value. As we know, the solution to this riddle is the existence of the commodity labor power, embodied in a class of propertyless producers. It is the purchase and use of this commodity by capitalists that makes possible the production of value in excess of its own value. Quote, the consumption of labor power is completed, as in the case of every other commodity, outside the market or the sphere of circulation, end quote. To understand the production of surplus value, therefore, we must leave the realm of appearances, quote, this noisy sphere, where everything takes place on the surface and in full view of everyone, end quote, for, quote, the hidden abode of production, end quote, Marx. This present represents a further break with the Ricardian model, of course. From Ricardo's point of view, quote, the principal problem in political economy, end quote, is, quote, to determine the laws which regulate, bracket, the, end bracket, distribution, end quote, of, quote, the produce of the earth, dot, 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 among three classes of the community, dot, 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 end quote. The second section of the Grundrisse introduction had such a view in mind, in considering the relation between production and the, quote, various rubrics which the economists place alongside it, end quote. Quote, production is determined by general laws of nature, distribution by social chance, and it may therefore exert a more or less stimulating influence on production. Dot, dot, dot. When looking through the ordinary run of economic works, one is struck at once by the fact that everything is posited twice in them, e.g., rent, wages, interest, and profit figure under the heading of distribution, while under the heading of production we see land, labor, and capital figure as agents of production, dot, dot, dot. Economists like Ricardo have, dot, 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 regarded distribution as the only object of bracket political and bracket economy, for they have instinctively treated the forms of distribution as the most definite expression in which the agents of production are found in a given society, end quote. Marx. Because of its double nature, the commodity form obscures the class relation on which the commodity form's dominance rests. For when the ability to work appears as a commodity, its exchange against money seems no different from any other act of market exchange. In Ricardo's words, quote, labor, like all other things which are purchased and sold, and which may be increased or diminished in quantity, has its natural and its market price, end quote. Ricardo. Thus, quote, the sphere of circulation or commodity exchange, within whose boundaries the sales and purchase of labor power goes on, is in fact a very Eden of the innate rights of man. It is the exclusive realm of freedom, equality, property, and Bentham. Freedom, because both buyer and seller of a commodity, let us say of labor power, are determined only by the buyer and sellers of labor power's own free will. The buyers and sellers of labor power contract as free persons, who are equal before the law, ... Equality, because each enters into relation with the other as with a simple owner of commodities, and the buyers and sellers of labor power exchange equivalent for equivalent. Property, because each disposes only of what is his own. And Bentham, because both the buyer and seller of labor power looks only to his own advantage. The only force bringing the buyer and seller of labor power together, bracket, as in Smith's description of the market, end bracket, ... is the selfishness, the gain, and private interest of each ... And precisely for that reason, either in accordance with the pre-established harmony of things, or under the auspices of an omniscient providence, the buyers and sellers of labor power all work together to their mutual advantage, for the common weal, and in the common interest. End quote. Marx, Captial, Volume 1. And if you haven't listened to me read before, I tend to fill in a lot of the pronouns. So if something says it, I try to make sure I'm remembering what it is. So in this case, I said buyers and sellers of labor power more than was actually in the text. So, end quote, Marx, Captial, Volume 1. These ideological categories, in their socialist as well as their bourgeois use, must be distinguished from the actual, quote, economic conditions of production, end quote. But this is not only to identify a scientific error. The actual conditions explain the appearance, to the common and the educated sense of bourgeois society, of the categories of economics as appropriate for the description of those conditions. A passage in the Grundrisse makes clear that this is an application of the, quote, guiding principle, end quote, of Marx's studies explained in the preface to the contribution. Quote, equality and freedom are not only respected in exchange, which is based on exchange values, but the exchange of exchange values is the real productive basis of all equality and freedom. As pure ideas, equality and freedom are merely idealized expressions of this exchange. Developed in juridical, political, and social relations, they are merely this basis on a higher level, end quote. Footnote. This last phrase is a striking variant of the concept of, quote, superstructure, end quote, suggesting the error involved in over-literal readings of Marx's architectural metaphor. End footnote. The centrality of economic discourse to capitalist life, which itself reflects the dominance of the commodity form as the general form of the product of labor, shapes the vocabulary of politics, along with other systems of representation, such as philosophy. It is for this reason that, quote, the anatomy of ... civil society ... has to be sought in political economy, end quote. Marx, a contribution to the critique of political economy. The inadequacies of political economy, however, will point the way to a radically new understanding of society. The domain of production provides the solution to the problem of the origin of surplus value, precisely because it does not share the essential features of the marketplace. The domain of circulation. Freedom and equality are gone. The exchange of labor power for wage concluded, quote, the worker works under the control of the capitalist to whom his labor belongs, ... end quote. The nature of capital becomes clear. What from the point of view of economics is alternatively a sum of money invested in production, or the means of production purchased with part of that sum is visible. In the activities constituting the production process, as a social power relation between employer and employee. Later in Volume 1, this redescription of capital is deepened in the course of Marx's explanation of capital accumulation. Looked at over time, a capitalist in the present hires workers with surplus value produced by workers in the past. Quote, the relation of exchange between capitalist and worker becomes a mere semblance belonging only to the process of circulation. The relation of exchange between capitalist and worker becomes a mere form, which is alien to the content of the transaction itself and merely mystifies the content of the transaction. End quote. Marx. Capital, Volume 1. In this way, the labor theory of value itself, the great theoretical conquest of classical political economy, and generally reputed the foundation of Marxist economics, is revealed to belong to the appearance of economic discourse. In the discussion of commodity exchange, quote, the rights of property seem to us to be grounded in man's own labor, end quote, since, quote, the means of appropriating the commodities of others was the alienation of man's own commodities, ... produced by labor, end quote. Quote, now, however, property turns out to be the right, on the part of the capitalist, to appropriate the unpaid labor of others or its product, and the impossibility, on the part of the worker, of appropriating his own product. The separation of property from labor thus becomes the necessary consequences of a law that apparently originated in their identity, end quote. This idea is developed in the manuscript Results of the Immediate Process of Production, which is on this channel, by the way. While, quote, capitalist production is the first to make the commodity into the general form of all produce, end quote, this system, quote, destroys the basis of commodity production insofar as the latter involves independent individual production and exchange of commodities between owners between owners or the exchange of equivalents, end quote. Marx. End footnote. The last sentence suggests this is not an injustice to be corrected by political force or the rights of labor, but is essential to the existence of a social system in which, quote, labor is the name of a factor of production, and which market exchange is an act involving, for all practical purposes, quote, only the mutually independent buyer and seller, end quote. Marx. Were we to examine the exchange process as one taking place between social classes, rather than between individuals, quote, we should be applying standards entirely foreign to economic production, to commodity production, end quote, and commodity production's self-representation, and commodity production's style of self-representation. From the viewpoint implied by those standards, however, value can be recognized to be a social form for the exploitation of one part of society by another in the guise of a principle of equality in exchange. While the exchange relation is a, quote, mere form, end quote, when it is a matter of explaining the origin of surplus value, according to Marx, actual modes of social life are determined by such forms. In another variation on the basis superstructure theme, Marx explains in Volume 3 of Capital that, quote, the scientific economic form in which unpaid surplus labor is pumped out of the direct producers determines the relationship of domination and servitude, end quote, that differentiates one form of class society from another, and so that, quote, on this is based the entire configuration of the economic community arising from the actual relations of production, and hence also its specific political form, end quote. Therefore, Capital must return, as it does in the second volume, to the circulation process with which the argument began. The commodity, or better, the commodity-money pair, remains the cell form of the specifically capitalist mode of exploitation. The specifically capitalist mode of exploitation. Wealth is not, as wealth appears an accumulation of commodities. Wealth is the accumulation of capital, and capital, quote, is not the only command over labor. Quote, is not only the command over labor, as Adam Smith thought, is essentially the command over unpaid labor, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. But capital operates only through the commodity form. It is the commodification of labor power that makes possible the control over other people's labor, in the specific form of surplus value, as it is the ownership of money, accumulated surplus labor, that gives its possessor that control. Quote, capital, as self-valorizing value, does not just comprise class relations, a definite social character that depends on the existence of labor as wage labor. It is a movement, a circulatory process through different stages, which itself in turn includes three different forms of the circulatory process, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 2. Hence the material contained in Volume 2, while covering a range of topics, above all demonstrates the category of the market. In economic terms, demand represents the social form of the reconstitution and growth of capital as a surplus labor extracting system. Footnote, quote, insofar as the capitalist simply personifies industrial capital, the capitalist's own demand consists simply in the demand for means of production and labor power, ... Insofar as the worker converts his wages almost wholly into means of subsistence, ... The capitalist's demand for labor power is indirectly also a demand for the means of consumption that enter into the consumption of the working class. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 2. This understanding, however, is only available on the basis of the critique of economic categories affected in the first volume. Indeed, according to Marx, a re-examination of the circulation process explains why to those whose experience is defined by its forms in action, quote, the conditions of the original production of value fall completely into the background, ... Both the restoration of the values advanced in production, and particularly the surplus value contained in the commodities, seem not just to be realized only in circulation, but actually to arise from it. The third volume of Capital, synthesizing the class relation at the heart of the capitalist production, with the specific forms in which capitals interact with one another, in explaining the forms taken by surplus value in circulation, profit, interest, and rent, accounts more thoroughly for the, quote, everyday consciousness of the agents of production themselves, end quote, and for the economist theorization of that consciousness. Volume 3 concludes, accordingly, with a discussion of the way in which the workings of the economy obscure from view the nature of value, which seems to be not a representation of social labor under the control of capital, but a method for the fair division of the social product among those who have contributed in different ways to the social product's production. The portion of the social product necessary for the reproduction of the working class appears as wages, the price of labor, just as the labor required to reproduce the means of production appears as a portion of the price of the product. The labor performed beyond that required for reproduction, the surplus labor, appears in the various categories into which its money representation, quote, surplus value, end quote, is divided: profit, interest, rent, commercial profit, each the payment for a, quote, service, end quote, rendered by an owner of property. It must so appear, for in real economic life the various claimants to portions of the social product must be satisfied, at least in proportion to their ability to make their claims count for others, if that life is to continue. Only at this point in the argument is commodity exchange, with which Marx began, fully theorized, at least on the relatively abstract level of analysis, disregarding the various particular forms of competition at work in the world market undertaken in capital. As Marx observes in the manuscript published long after his death under the title Theories of Surplus Value, quote, to be produced, to be brought to the market, the commodity must at least fetch bracket A end bracket, market price, end quote, yielding a satisfactory rate of profit to its capitalist producer, quote, whether its own value be greater or smaller than that price, end quote. Since, as was established in the first volume of Capital, value provides the social form of the product of labor only when production is dominated by capital. Values are defined for products that are exchanged as products of capitals, not just as products of, quote, social labor, end quote. Though the labor input to the production of a given firm counts as socially necessary only to the extent that the exchange makes it a part of social labor time, the commodity is exchanged as part of the social product only as the private property of a capitalist firm. Its price must therefore ideally yield to its owner-producer a rate of profit at least as high as that received by any other firm. As a result, according to Marx, quote, just because the value of the commodity is determined by labor time, the average price of the commodities, can never be equal to their value, although this determination of the average price is only derived from the value which is based on labor time, end quote. Value, which regulates capitalist society as a system of class exploitation, is invisible in market exchange. Here it appears only in the form of the exchange value, in money terms, of commodities, determined for all practical purposes by relations of supply and demand, in which the various divisions of surplus value appear as so many elements of a commodity's price. It is quite natural, Marx concluded, quote, that the actual agents of production feel themselves completely at home in these estranged and irrational forms, For these are precisely the configurations of appearance in which they move and with which they are daily involved, end quote. It is equally natural that those he called, quote, vulgar economists, end quote, the ancestors of today's neoclassical writers, whose theory is, quote, nothing more than a more or less doctrinaire translation of the everyday notions of the actual agents of production, end quote, elaborate the same points of view, while even the classical economists, quote, remained more or less trapped in the world of illusion, end quote. Their theorizing had attempted to penetrate. Thus, at the end of the third volume of Marx's work, Marx returns to his starting point, the capitalist economy as it is represented in economic discourse, both the, quote, religion of everyday life, end quote, and the theology elaborated by economists, as a set of institutions structured by exchange relations. For the production of goods satisfying human desires, wealth is an accumulation of commodities. On the other hand, the consciousness of capitalism's critics must also be explained, and even the understanding, however limited, or the system's structural difficulties represented by the political economists' conception of tendency of the rate of profit to fall. The discussion of the process of capital accumulation in the first volume of Captial concludes with a consideration of, quote, the influence of the growth of capital on the fate of the working class, end quote. Marx. Discovering the consequences of accumulation in the tendential replacement of living labor by means of production, on the one hand, and the cycle of expansion and contraction produced by the need to reorganize the social structure of capital in response to changing conditions of accumulation on the other, Marx argues that, quote, in proportion as capital accumulates, the situation of the worker, be his payment high or low, must grow worse, end quote. In bad times, unemployment rises, wages fall, and working conditions worsen. But even in good times, quote, all methods for raising the social productivity of labor are put into effect at the cost of the individual worker, ... so that they become means of domination and exploitation of the producers, end quote. It is in these terms that Marx accounted for the workers' movements of the 19th century, arguing that the growth of, quote, the mass of misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, and exploitation, end quote, brought with it, quote, the revolt of the working class, ... trained, united, and organized by the very mechanism of the capitalist mode of production, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. As the first volume of Capital progresses from an analysis of appearances, capitalism's economic representation as a system of commodity exchanges between individuals, to a redescription of the system as one of class exploitation, Capital ends appropriately with the effects of the working class of this system on the working class and, to a redescription of the system as one of class exploitation. The first volume of Capital ends appropriately with the effects of the working of this system on the working class and the promise of, quote, the expropriation of a few usurpers by the mass of the people, end quote. In the third volume, which examines the operation of the economic categories that obscure the actual class structure of society, the same subject is re-examined, this time as it appears in the vicissitudes of the category of profit. Profit is defined in the first two parts of the volume as surplus value, considered as the return to capital invested in labor power and means of production. This is to look at surplus value from what one may call the viewpoint of a schematic capitalist. As experienced by actual capitalists, surplus value appears under different rubrics, as interest and rent, as well as profit, topics taken up later in Volume 3, depending on the particular nature of the claim made to it. In Part 3, Marx presents his law of the tendential fall of the rate of profit, quote, before depicting the decomposition of profit into various categories which have become mutually autonomous, end quote, in order to show how, quote, the law in its generality is independent of that division and of the mutual relationships of the categories of profit deriving from it, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 3. In a letter written to Engels after the publication of the first volume of Capital, Marx listed as the first of the, quote, fundamentally new elements of the book, end quote, that, quote, in contrast to all previous political economy, which from the outset treated the particular fragments of surplus value with the particular fragments of surplus value's fixed forms of rent, profit, and interest as already given, I begin dealing with the general form of surplus value, in which all these elements, rent, profit, and interest, are still undifferentiated, in solution, as it were, end quote. Marx, Letter to Engels, 8th of January, 1968. Given the result established in the second part of Volume 1, that the expansion of value definitive of capital cannot be explained on the basis of exchange relations, but only in terms of the expropriation of unpaid labor time, that is, in terms of the class relation between workers and capitalists, quote, surplus value, end quote, is the explanatory illuminating name for the revenues known as the agents of production and distribution as profit, rent, etc. As Marx observed to Engels in another letter, the treatment of the struggle over the length of the working day which follows the analysis of surplus value in Capital, quote, demonstrates ad oculus to what extent those bourgeois gentlemen comprehend the source and nature of their profit in practice. Were economic theory to employ the concept of surplus value, however, it would have to give up the idea that capitalism is completely describable as a system of market exchanges, for this concept involves understanding labor power as unique among commodities in its capacity to produce, when consumed, more value than labor power represents. It is for this reason, Marx argues in Volume 3, that the economists, while they perceive the phenomenon of the tendency of the profit rate to fall, most spectacularly visible in the recurrent crises that afflicted capitalism during the 19th century, quote, tortured themselves with their contradictory attempts to explain it, end quote. In Marx's view, this law, given its importance for the life of the social system, quote, forms the mystery around whose solution the whole of political economy since Adam Smith revolves, and, the difference between the various schools since Adam Smith consists of the different attempts to solve it, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 3. The insolubility of this mystery arose from the internal structure of the discourse of economics. The impossibility of understanding the functioning of capitalism in terms of economic concepts, which nevertheless are experienced as, quote, natural and fundamental categories of social life by those who employ them. A theory capable of explaining both capitalist accumulation and its crisis tendency required a redescription of economic relationships as relations of class exploitation. It is for this very reason that, once having solved the mystery, Marx devotes the remainder of Volume 3 to the explanation of economic appearances, having worked out the forms taken by surplus value, more correctly the phenomena described in terms of, quote, surplus value. Marx can then examine economic reality as economic appears in, quote, vulgar economic theory, as the production of wealth by the three factors of production, capital, land, and labor, to whose owners revenue accordingly and justly flows as profit or interest, rent, and wages. The entire text of this work to this point has exposed the reality experienced in the form of these categories. Here Marx is in a position to explain their power. For the trinity of economic factors actually are the sources of their specific revenues, quote, in the sense that capital for the capitalist is a perpetual pumping machine for surplus value, land for the landowner a permanent magnet for attracting a part of the surplus value pumped out by capital, and finally, labor the constantly self-renewing condition and means for the worker to obtain a part of the value he has produced, and hence a part of social product measured by this portion of value under the heading of wages, end quote. Marx. Capital, Volume 3. The viability of economic discourse is in this way shown to depend on the fact that, quote, the capitalist mode of production, like every other, constantly reproduces not only the material product, but also the socio-economic relations, the formal economic determinants of the capitalist mode of production's formation, end quote. Economic theory gains its plausibility from the conformity of its conceptual apparatus to the assumptions embodied in commercial calculations and contracts. And these assumptions maintain their power because people naturally attempt to carry on their lives within the social relations in which they find themselves caught up, of which the assumptions provide the structural terms. As Marx put it, in a concise statement of the culturally constructed character of social reality. Quote, the specific shape in which the value components of social wealth confront one another is presupposed because it is constantly reproduced, and it is constantly reproduced because it is constantly presupposed. End quote. Marx. On the other hand, Marx has argued that the reproduction of capitalist social relations involves a tendency to economic crisis, and that this, given the massive degradation of working class life it entails, contains the possibility of social crisis. Marx emphasized the historically specific, and so in principle transitory nature of economic categories in the postface to the second edition of Capital's first volume, asserting that, quote, the fact that the movement of capitalist society is full of contradictions impresses itself most strikingly on the practical bourgeois in the changes of the periodic cycle through which modern industry passes, the summit of which is the general crisis, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. This remark gives a particular content to the general proposition in the preface to the contribution that, quote, an era of social revolution, end quote, begins when, quote, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, ... end quote. Marx uses nearly the same words at the end of Volume 3 of Capital when Marx cites the notion, particularly associated with J.S. Mill, but shared generally by political economists, that the only relations of distribution are historical, and not only the relations of distribution are historical, and not the relations of production. In reality, says Marx, and this can stand as a summary of Capital's critique of economics, production is only ever carried on within the social framework represented by particular relations of distribution, or claims to the social product. That a, quote, contradiction and antithesis between, on the one hand, the relations of distribution, hence also the specific form of relation of production corresponding to them, and on the other hand, the productive forces, productivity, and the development of its agents, gains in breadth and depth, end quote, is the sign that a moment of social crisis has arrived in which the construction of new forms of social life is possible. Marx explained the timid criticism of capitalism he saw in J.S. Mill's differentiation between distribution and production as a reaction to the evidence of the system's tendency to such crisis. Marx's own work, as though a critique of the categories of life and thought in which economists like Mill were caught, alongside the, quote, actual agents of production, end quote, was made possible by his engagement with the working class movements that Marx believed were working out new categories of social action. A positive critique of economics, Capital is also, one might say, a negative theory of socialism, clarifying the social relations that need to be abolished for a fundamental break with capitalism to be accomplished. Consciousness, both that embodied in economic discourse and that capable of imagining a new mode of social life, is thus, quote, explained from the contradictions of material life, end quote, as the preface to the contribution demanded and promised. Okay, so that is the end of the essay, Theory as Critique, by Paul Mattick, Jr. Thank you so much for listening.